A locksmith's home, a locked room, and one lifeless body. Nothing stolen, except the truth. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Let me know where you're tuning in from by dropping a comment below. I always look forward to reading your thoughts and seeing where our mystery travels. Let's dive in. The drizzle was fine enough that Margaret did not bother with his umbrella. It hung from his arm, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of quiet patrols, polite refusals, and long silences outside closed doors. He had just stepped off the number 27 bus near the Boulevard de Courcelles, where his wife's cousin lived alone in a modest third-floor apartment. They had taken to visiting him once a month since his mild stroke the previous winter. Not out of obligation, though Madame Margaret would have used that word, but out of a softness Margaret never named aloud. The man always had a jar of mustard biscuits waiting for them, though he never ate them himself. The visit had gone as expected, faintly tedious, filled with digressions about the price of leeks and how the concierge was surely watering down the heating again. Madame Maigret listened with endless patience while Maigret himself wandered to the window more than once, watching the fog rise gently off the street lamps. He had said little, nodded often, and accepted 2 cups of coffee despite preferring beer. When they left, Madame Maigret lingered for a moment with her cousin at the door, fussing gently over his scarf. So it was already dark when Maigret stepped off the curb, the bus having dropped them near the Parc Monceau. She had gone home ahead, claiming dinner would be simple and warm. He had not asked what it would be. Instead, he walked with no clear destination in mind, letting the wet light of Paris gather slowly in the folds of his coat. It was the hour when things were being folded away, butcher stalls swept clean, shutters pulled closed against the creeping cold, bakers wiping counters with rhythmic fatigue. He lit a pipe and paused near the corner of Rue des Dames, where a little locksmith's shop sat pressed between a creperie and an old tobacconist's. With curling signage, the locksmith's door was closed, and the display, a pale felt board with brass keys arranged in staggered rows, was lit by a single overhead bulb. It should have seemed ordinary. Perhaps it was, but something in its silence struck him, a feeling, not of menace, not even of disarray, but of a particular stillness, the kind that did not belong to a place like this, where metal tools and human need usually churn together in quiet industry. Maigret stood there longer than necessary, as if waiting for the rain to change. A man passed behind him, with a dog on a short leash, nodding briefly without recognition. The locksmith's shop remained as it was, narrow, mute, not suspicious, just closed. But it was not quite closed for the evening. That was what bothered him. He crossed the street slowly, as if pulled by nothing more than curiosity. There was no sign in the window, announcing hours, and yet there was an impression of recent activity, the faint smell of hot metal, the curtain inside slightly askew. Through the glass he could make out the workbench near the back, a clutter of pliers, copper shavings, and what looked like a sandwich plate with a single bite missing. He might have walked on, and in any other mood he would have. But there was something about the shop, the stillness, the untouched plate, the sharp smell, not fresh but not fully stale, that kept him there. He tried the door. It was locked. The irony made him smile faintly. From the narrow alley to the right came a sound. Not a footstep, not a voice, but a sort of clatter, muffled and distant. A drain pipe dislodged, or a cat. But when he turned to look, the alley was empty. He stood still, letting his presence settle into the street like a stone sinking into water. The pipe smoked evenly between his fingers. He could feel it forming. The unease, that was not yet a question. The weightless tension that preceded knowledge. He did not know what had happened inside the locksmith's shop. In fact, he did not know that anything had happened at all. But he stood there, motionless, his gaze on the curtains half twist in the faint flicker of movement at the rear of the building, no more than a suggestion. And he waited. Not for confirmation. Not even for noise. He waited, because something in the night had stopped breathing. And that was often how it began. A gust of air stirred the narrow alley beside the locksmith's shop, carrying with it the scent of damp plaster and old iron. Maigret's coat collar held the light mist as he leaned slightly into the glass, not to peer, for that would have seemed too eager, but to allow the edges of his sight to gather detail quietly, as he so often did. The bench inside bore no signs of panic. A pair of spectacles rested beside a small vase. There was an open envelope too, the corner curled by moisture, though there had been no rain inside. He did not knock. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back again, scanning the upper windows. Only one was lit. Second floor, right above the locksmith's shop, a weak bulb with the dull yellow of gaslight, as if filtered through old curtains. A figure moved behind it briefly, obscured by what might have been a bookshelf or a wardrobe. Then, stillness again. A sound behind him made him turn. Slow, hesitant steps over wet cobblestone. A woman in a blue overcoat, hair tucked under a woolen scarf, was approaching from the south end of the street. She walked with the tentative caution of someone hoping not to be noticed, but expecting to be. When she caught sight of Maigret, she slowed, then stopped altogether. For a second her eyes flicked to the locksmith's door. "He's usually closed by now," she said without being asked, her voice soft and low, more observation than greeting. "Closes at 6, sometimes earlier, if he's in a mood." Maigret nodded, but didn't answer. He watched her face instead, not for guilt or concealment, but for familiarity. She looked like someone who lived nearby. Clean shoes, no makeup, hands clasped inside her coat cuffs for warmth. "You know him?" Maigret asked, finally, gently, as if it were idle curiosity. "Everyone does, around here," she replied, after a moment. "Monsieur Lenoir, he's been in that shop since before the war. Alone now. His wife died years ago." There was a pause. The woman hesitated, clearly debating with herself, then took 2 steps closer. "I saw his lights on when I passed earlier, around 6:30, but it's dark now." Maigret looked back toward the window. The weak light upstairs still burned. "Did he usually work late?" he asked, carefully keeping any suspicion from his tone. "Never." He was very precise. "Up at 7. Shop by 8. Lunch at noon. Closed by 6. I used to joke he must set the clocks for the church." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth but vanished almost immediately. Her eyes drifted to the glass again, and she seemed to grow uneasy. "I only ask," Maigret said gently, "because something about it feels wrong." She gave a quick, small nod, as though relieved to hear the unease voiced by someone else. "I thought so too. That's why I came back." "Silly, isn't it?" "Not at all." She seemed to consider this, then fumbled inside her coat for a moment and produced a key. "I clean his place sometimes, not often, just enough to keep the dust from winning." Maigret's eyes held on the key, but said nothing. "I could go in," she offered, "if you wanted. Let's go in together." They crossed to the door without another word. She fit the key into the lock with practiced care, and the mechanism gave way with a low, reluctant click. The smell hit them at once, faint but unmistakable. Not rot, not blood, but something sour. Something halted too suddenly. Food left out. A room kept closed too long. Inside, the shop was warm, overly so. A small gas heater at the back was still lit, pulsing low against the wood paneling. The curtain behind the front counter shifted gently in their wake. She stepped back instinctively as Maigret passed into the rear workroom. The workbench was as he had seen it, tools in their places, glasses beside the vase, the sandwich untouched. A teacup sat near the edge, half full, with a thin film forming on the surface. But it was the door at the back, barely ajar, that drew his eye. He opened it slowly, without sound. The staircase beyond was narrow and straight, a single carpet runner worn thin down the middle. He climbed it deliberately, pipe still clenched between his teeth, his steps like the ticking of a cautious clock. The second-floor landing was small, just enough space for a coat rack and a mirror, with its silver peeling at the edges. The light came from a half-open door on the left. The apartment was quiet. Maigret knocked gently on the door frame, more out of habit than expectation. "Bonjour," he said softly. Nothing. He entered. The room was a parlor, modest, heavy with lace and memory. There was a thin carpet, a single armchair by the gas stove, a table with a chessboard, whose game had been frozen mid-match. A cup of black coffee, cold and untouched, sat next to it. Then he saw the body. It lay sprawled at the foot of the stove, one arm outstretched, the other tucked beneath him. The face was turned away, the bald patch at the crown of the head shining faintly in the lamplight. Maigret moved forward slowly and crouched beside the body. No visible wound, no blood, just a stillness that confirmed what instinct had already told him. Behind him, the cleaner, the woman in the blue coat, stood silently in the doorway. "Is it?" she began, then stopped herself. Maigret nodded once. She crossed herself without ceremony. Then she whispered, "He never locked the door from inside." Maigret turned to her. "What do you mean?" "If he was upstairs," she said, "he left the shop unlocked. Said it was bad for business to seem shut out. If the shop door's locked, someone else did it." Maigret rose. There was a small smudge on the floor near the body. Something gray like fine powder or ash. He made a mental note but did not touch it. Instead, he looked around the room. Nothing seemed ransacked. No drawers ajar. No signs of struggle. "Do you know if he had any family?" Maigret asked, his voice low. "None in Paris. A nephew in Lyon, I think. But they hadn't spoken in years." He nodded again and moved to the chessboard. The white bishop was out of place. Not in the middle of a move, just displaced, as though picked up and never put back properly. He returned to the body. "Would you wait downstairs?" he asked her, kindly. She obeyed without protest. Her footsteps muffled as she retreated down the stairs. Alone, Maigret stood in the dim light and let the quiet fill him. The heater's soft ticking, the smell of extinguished life, the untouched coffee. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but something deeply wrong. He returned downstairs, where the woman sat at the edge of the workbench, hands folded, eyes vacant. The gas heater cast flickering light across her face. Maigret opened the front door for a breath of colder air, then reached into his coat for a match to relight his pipe. He struck it once, twice, the sulfur flaring briefly before settling into amber. "Your name?" he asked softly. "Jean," she said. "Jean Pardon. You saw him today?" "This morning. He was fine." He nodded. And she added, in a whisper. He looked nervous. Not scared, exactly. Just tighter. He kept checking the time, asked if I had ever heard a lock click when no one was near it. She gave a faint, awkward smile. I thought he was being poetic. Maigret said nothing. His pipe smoked evenly. Rain had begun again outside, a light, persistent tapping on the glass. "Would you stay nearby?" he asked her. She nodded. "Of course." Maigret stepped back into the doorway, watching the street that now glistened under the steady drizzle. A single black umbrella passed, held low, obscuring the walker's face. He did not yet know the shape of the truth, but he knew its presence. It had passed through here, and it had locked the door behind itself. Maigret remained in the doorway a moment longer, his silhouette still against the faint flicker of the shop's heater. Jean had not moved, though her fingers had begun to fidget with the cuff of her sleeve, twisting the wool between thumb and forefinger as if trying to remember something. Outside, the rain persisted without drama, steady and unobtrusive, a gray veil between one building and the next. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once. The sound was quickly absorbed into the soft murmur of the city settling into night. He turned back inside and gently closed the door. The lock clicked with finality, not from distrust, but from habit. The narrowness of the shop, the closeness of its walls, seemed more pronounced now that the death upstairs had registered not only in his mind, but in the room itself. Death had a way of thickening the air. It made space feel tighter, not wider, as though the absence left behind still pressed outward. Maigret reached for the phone near the front counter, an old black model with a frayed cord and numbers that had faded from use. He called the station. His voice was calm, unhurried. He asked for a medical examiner and a pair of uniforms to come quietly, without lights or fuss. Just enough presence to make it official, not enough to stir curiosity in the building across the street. He returned the receiver to its cradle and sat down on the stool behind the counter. Jane was watching him now, expectant, not with panic or suspicion but with the quiet tension of someone who had, perhaps for too long, sensed something she could not name and now hoped someone else would name it for her. He wasn't a man people disliked, she said, almost to herself. Maigret glanced at her, but she shrugged, eyes on the floor. But he kept to himself, didn't gossip, didn't smile, unless there was a reason. He wasn't cold, just private. The sort of man who didn't explain things he didn't feel he owed anyone. He spoke to you. Because I was quiet too. There was something gentle in the way she said it. Not boastful, not defensive, just true. It was a kind of self-awareness Maigret always appreciated in people. Not the need to be good or right, but simply clear. Did he have visitors? Rarely. Men from the trade, mostly. Other locksmiths. Once or twice a policeman with a broken key. Not you, of course. Young ones. The kind who don't check before turning too hard. But late, she stopped, then looked up. Lately, there's been someone new. Maigret's eyes did not move, but he allowed a pause to settle between them, giving her time to fill it if she chose. I saw him a few days ago. A man. Not young, not old. Maybe 40, well dressed, but not quite at ease in it. As if the suit didn't belong to him. They argued. Not loudly, but you could tell, you feel it in your bones when two people aren't saying what they mean. Did you hear any of it? She shook her head. Only one word. Or rather, one name. Marcel. Maigret made a small grunt, barely audible. Jean looked uncertain. Could that be the nephew from Lyon? She asked. Possibly. Maigret murmured. But I've yet to confirm whether the nephew exists. He stood and walked slowly to the back of the shop. The curtain shifted again as he passed, brushing lightly against his shoulder. The smell of metal, faint and acrid, was sharper here. Not from tools, but from something scorched. He opened the tiny back window over the stairwell. The alley beyond was slick with water, and a faint shimmer of movement reflected off the puddles, though no one was there now. Downstairs, the front door creaked faintly, not from being opened, but from the shift in air, as someone approached outside. Jean straightened, and Maigret stepped forward just as the knock came. Two officers, young, polite, and slightly damp, stepped in and removed their hats. Behind them, Dr. Locksmith, stooped and smelling faintly of cough lozenges and shoe polish, greeted Maigret with a nod. The stairs? He asked. Maigret pointed silently. The doctor climbed them without delay. The officers lingered awkwardly near the entrance until Maigret motioned for one to join him at the rear door, and the other to remain with Jean. There was nothing to guard, really, but presence could be a comfort or a warning, and both were useful in the right measure. The rear alley intrigued him. There were two doors, one leading from the locksmith's back room, the other farther down, likely attached to a building that backed onto another street. The second door had been repainted recently, pale green, the sort used when someone wanted to appear clean without drawing attention. It was slightly ajar. Maigret walked toward it slowly, pipe still in hand though he had not lit it again. The rain gathered in droplets on the brim of his hat. He reached the door and pressed it open with one knuckle. Inside was a narrow passage, stone-floored, leading to a stairwell not unlike the locksmith's, but more worn. He climbed halfway, listening. A television murmured faintly 2 floors up. A child cried somewhere beyond, quickly hushed. Then footsteps measured, deliberate, descending. He waited at the bend in the stair, not concealed but not obvious. A man emerged, carrying a folded coat. Early 40s, tall but slouched, with a mustache too careful for his otherwise drab appearance. Their eyes met briefly, and Maigret said nothing. "Bonsoir," the man offered too quickly. Maigret nodded. "You live here?" the man asked, with polite suspicion. "No." The man hesitated. "Do you?" Maigret allowed a moment before answering. "Not yet." He stepped aside to let the man pass. The man did, glancing over his shoulder once before vanishing into the wet dark. Maigret waited a beat longer, then returned through the alley. Inside, Dr. Lacombe was at the bottom of the stairs, brushing off his coat. "Quiet," he said. "No sign of struggle. Likely a stroke. Unless something interfered." "Something?" Maigret asked. "Hard to say. No marks, no trauma. Just that." He hesitated, then continued. "Just that his expression seemed too calm. Too calm for death. Too calm for surprise." Maigret thought about that as the doctor left. Upstairs, death had arrived without fear. And yet there had been fear before. Juman had seen it. Lenoir had spoken of phantom clicks and imagined lock. He returned to the chessboard. The displaced bishop, the cold coffee, the envelope on the workbench downstairs. He retrieved it, unfolded it gently. Inside was a single page, no return address. The handwriting was firm, slightly right-leaning. Neat. It read, "I will come again. This time I will not knock. You owe me more than silence." No signature. Maigret reread it, then folded it once more and returned it to its envelope. He looked around the shop. Nothing was missing, nothing out of place, but every object seemed to heave now, faintly, as if each held some part of the quiet violence that had passed through the narrow house and left behind only a locked door, a misaligned bishop, and a silence that smelled faintly of burnt iron, and perhaps, somewhere nearby, a man named Marcel. Maigret remained behind the counter long after the others had left. Jean, subdued and obedient, had gone home at his suggestion, though she promised to return if needed. The young officers had been relieved by an older patrolman and his partner, men who knew how to stand in a room without intruding. The medical examiner's quiet departure had left behind no medical certainty, only that vague remark, "too calm for surprise," which Maigret found himself returning to again and again. He was alone with the letter now. It lay on the bench in front of him, open but untouched. The single line etched into his thoughts more than the page itself. "I will come again. This time I will not knock. You owe me more than silence." It was not a threat in the usual sense. There was no demand, no bluster. It was almost intimate. The kind of sentence written by someone who had been patient long enough, by someone who once asked and was refused. The bishop on the chessboard upstairs, it too had refused to be ignored. He left the shop just before midnight, locking it carefully behind him. The keys he slipped into his coat pocket. The rain had slowed to a fine mist again. Enough to wet the shoulders of his overcoat, but not enough to distract his thoughts. He walked the street at a slow pace, stopping once beneath the awning of the tobacconist's next door. The glass there reflected his face faintly, tired, lined, unshaven, but it also caught the upper floor of the locksmith's apartment. The curtain had been drawn now. It looked from this distance as though the window had never belonged to anything but darkness. He made his way down to the corner cafe, the one near the bus stop where the drivers sometimes came for a sandwich late in the evening. It was still open. Inside, the floor was wet, from shoes and umbrellas, the air thick with coffee and tobacco. The woman behind the counter, round-faced, gray-haired, nodded at him and poured a Calvados without being asked. Maigret sat at the back, beneath the clock that always ran 7 minutes slow. He sipped in silence. Around him, 2 men played cards in the corner, half-heartedly arguing about a misplayed hand. Nothing about them was remarkable, and that in itself pleased him. Ordinary people, living ordinary nights. It was the contrast that always helped him think. He removed his pipe, but did not light it. Instead, he fished into his pocket and pulled out the envelope again. The paper was standard, no watermark. The handwriting, firm but plain. He imagined the man writing it, seated, perhaps, in a rented room. Alone. No radio, no clock ticking, just the sound of his own pen and the soft drag of breath. You owe me more than silence. Oh, that was the word that would not leave him. Not accuse, not punish, not revenge. Oh, he left the cafe at midnight and took a cab to Quai des Orfèvres. The duty sergeant barely looked up when Maigret passed through. Upstairs, the light in his office was cold and blue under the electric bulb. He sat, letting the silence of the room envelop him, then called for the Lyon registry. It took 20 minutes, but the answer came. Marcel Lenoir, born 1922, nephew of Jules Lenoir, the locksmith. No criminal record. Worked briefly as a machinist, then as a traveling salesman. Last known residence, Rue des Primevères, Lyon. Left the city 8 months ago. No forwarding address. Maigret made a note in the corner of his blotter. He closed his eyes a moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. A nephew estranged, with no criminal record, no known profession now. Yet someone, perhaps this Marcel, had returned. Not to steal, not to rage, but to speak, and when refused, to wait in silence until silence itself became unbearable. By morning, the street outside the locksmith's shop was washed clean by the night's drizzle. The patrolman on duty saluted wearily when Maigret arrived, just after 8. He nodded, opened the door with the key he had taken, and stepped inside. The heater had gone cold. He relit it slowly, methodically. Then, in the warmth that followed, he examined the shop with fresh eyes. There were no cameras, no ledgers out of place, no sign that money had been stolen. But the habits of a man are written in the corners of his routine, and Maigret noticed one, the way the drawers had been labeled, neatly in pencil, with initials. JL for Jules Lenoir, ML for Marcel Lenoir, and one drawer, marked ML, had been emptied. He opened the others. Inside were small things, letters, a photo, some folded receipts, a notebook with a list of repair calls. In the ML drawer, only the indentation of what had once been there remained, and a faint smell, linseed oil perhaps, or something older. The drawer had not simply been emptied, it had been emptied recently. Jean returned as promised. Her coat damp, but her eyes alert. She entered without ceremony, pausing only to remove her gloves. He did not ask if she had slept. It was written in the slow movement of her limbs that she had not. Did he ever mention his nephew to you? Maigret asked, gently. Only once, she said. 4 or 5 months ago, I was wiping the window and mentioned the name. It was on an envelope. Marcel Lenoir. Marcel Lenoir. He got very quiet, said, some names carry more weight than the memories behind them. I didn't ask. Was he afraid? She considered it. Not afraid, but regretful. Like someone who'd already lost the chance to make something right. Maigret nodded. The silence grew. Would you look at something, he asked, and handed her the letter. She read it once, her brow tightening slightly. Then again, her eyes lingered on the last line. I saw someone last week, she said slowly. I didn't think of it until now. He waited, a man in a gray coat, watching the shop from across the street. He wasn't loitering. He was just still. You'd only notice if you'd cleaned that window as many times as I have. He stood there for 10, 15 minutes, then walked away. She paused, but he wasn't watching the door. What then? The window, upstairs. Maigret nodded and took out his notebook. He scribbled something, then tore the page free. Would you go to the precinct? There's a clerk there, Lepointy, young, tall, always eating hard candy. Give him this and ask him to check every guest registry within a 10-block radius for a man named Marcel. Any spelling. And any man renting a room with no ID. She nodded, slipped the paper into her coat, and left. Maigret remained. He walked slowly back to the chessboard, its pieces still frozen in unfinished play. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without touching a thing, He turned and sat in the chair opposite the armchair by the stove. From there he could see the window Jeanne had mentioned. It framed a narrow view of the street. A good view for watching and being watched. He sat. He waited. And outside, the city moved on, slowly, softly, under a low gray sky. The warmth from the relit stove moved slowly across the small upstairs parlor, gathering in corners, beneath the lace curtains, under the thin carpet that muffled Maigret's steps. He sat still in the chair near the chessboard, his coat open but not removed, pipe in hand but unlit. Outside, the street below stirred gently to life, unnoticed by the upper window that framed it like a faded photograph. A bread cart passed first, then a delivery van paused near the corner. A girl with a green umbrella crossed diagonally, stepping lightly over puddles without seeming to see them. From this chair, Maigret could see what Lenoir had seen every morning and every evening: the rhythm of the street, the sameness of faces, and if one face lingered too long, returned too often, it would have stood out not by its features, but by its refusal to fit the frame. The man Jeanne had seen, still, watching not the door but the window, had not come as a stranger. He had come for something already known, or something owed. Maigret's thoughts returned to the drawer labeled ML. There had been something in it, something important enough to be taken, but not valuable enough to leave the shop in disarray. No sign of panic, no money stolen, no drawer forced. The absence had been deliberate, chosen with care, perhaps even permitted. A soft knock at the door below brought him from his thoughts. He stood and moved down the narrow stairway, pausing on the bottom step. The knock came again, polite, tentative. When he opened the door, the patrolman nodded and stepped aside to let Jeanne pass. She removed her gloves slowly, her cheeks red from the cold. There was no urgency in her manner, but a quiet purpose in the way she set her bag down and reached into her coat pocket. "Le Pointed found something," she said. "A guest house on Rue des Batignolles. Not far. A man checked in 5 days ago. No papers, paid in cash. Name he gave was Marcelin. Just that." The landlady described him: tall, thin, dark mustache. Said he kept to himself. Left late, came back late, wore gloves, even indoors. Maigret's eyes narrowed faintly. "Gloves," he repeated. Jeanne nodded. She thought it was strange, but not illegal. She let it go. He reached for his overcoat and motioned for Jean to remain behind. The officers downstairs were given quick instructions: one to stay at the shop, the other to accompany him. The rain had turned to a thick drizzle again, clinging to the air like old smoke. They walked. Rue des Batignolles ran crooked through a row of low buildings, many still bearing bullet scars from the war. The guest house was on the 3rd floor of a sagging block. Its name, Maison Le Vergon, barely legible on a warped placard above the doorbell. The landlady, small and yellow-eyed from cigarettes, greeted Maigret with the suspicion of someone used to being bothered, but never helped. "Room 5, she said after a glance at his card. "3rd floor rear." "He's not all rear. He's not all rear. He's not all..." "Did he say where he was going?" She laughed. "He barely says good morning." Maigret climbed the stairs without further questions. Room 5 was at the end of a narrow corridor, its door painted blue in a color long out of fashion. He knocked. No answer. He tried again, waited. Then he motioned for the officer to step back as he produced a small leather wallet of tools. The lock gave easily. A locksmith's door, Maigret thought grimly. It had not been secured as one would secure a secret. Inside, the room was dim and airless, the curtains drawn, the bed unmade. The lamp on the table had a burnt-out bulb, and a faint odor of oil and leather hung in the air. Not fresh, not rancid, just long-lived. He searched slowly, methodically. In the drawer, by the bed, 3 shirts, neatly folded, a pair of gloves, black leather, worn at the fingertips, a fountain pen. Beneath the mattress, nothing. In the small wardrobe, a single suit and coat. In the lining of the coat, something crinkled. He drew it out. A photograph. Black and white, faded at the corners. Two boys, one older, serious, unsmiling, the other smaller, slightly blurred, with wide-set eyes and a crooked smile on the back, in pencil. Jules and Marcel, 1936, Parc de Montsouris. Maigret turned it over twice, then tucked it into his notebook. On the small table by the window, a half-finished letter, written on the same kind of paper as the one found in the shop, in the same precise handwriting. You made a promise. You told her I would not be alone, that I would have a home. Maigret read it twice. The rest of the page was blank. The pen sat beside it, uncapped. The ink dried on its nib. He pocketed the page and left the room as he had found it. In the corridor, he paused, listening. A man passed below, coughing heavily. A door shut 3 rooms over. But there was no sound of return. Marcel or Marcellin had vanished again, and now Maigret knew why. Not rage, not money, not pride, guilt, deferred promises. Perhaps an orphaned boy passed from hand to hand, a burden accepted out of duty, then forgotten, then written off entirely. And now, years later, a man had returned not to accuse but to remind, and Lenoir had known what the visit meant. When Maigret stepped back into the locksmith's shop, Jeanne looked up from the chair near the stove. She was staring at the chessboard. "I moved the bishop back," she said softly. "I hope that was all right." "It's better," he replied. "Things should be where they belong." He handed her the photograph. She studied it, her expression softening with something like understanding. "He had this in his wallet once," she said. He took it out, looked at it, and then put it away. "Never spoke of it, because it says everything," Maigret murmured. She handed it back. "Do you think he killed him?" she asked. Maigret shook his head. "No. He came to ask something. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps a place. And Lenoir, he died before he could answer. Or perhaps he did answer, in silence." The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, a tram rumbled by. A child's voice called once, then was gone. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the smoke curling toward the window. "We'll find Marcel," he said. "But it won't be about punishment. Not this time." Jeanne didn't reply. She only sat, her eyes fixed on the pieces of a chess game no one had finished. In a house where silence had spoken first. By mid-afternoon, the narrow house on Rue de Dames had settled into a hush so complete that Maigret could hear the soft knock of the clock on the mantel upstairs, counting out each minute with somber regularity. He stood once more in the locksmith's living room, his coat draped over a chair, pipe resting cold in the ashtray beside a cup of dark, untouched coffee. The photograph sat on the table beside it, faintly curling at the edges. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to dim, smudging the corners of buildings and casting the rain-slicked street in muted gray. The faint glow of shop fronts had begun to appear like quiet islands across the boulevard. Jeanne had left again. Not dismissed, but released. And the officers downstairs had changed shifts, their replacements now standing with folded arms beneath the doorway. Bored, but respectful. There had been no word from Lapointe yet. No one had seen Marcel return to the boarding house. No additional guest registries had produced a match. And still, Maigret felt it, the presence of someone who had not yet truly left. He walked the room again, slowly, listening not for sounds but for absence. There was something unresolved, not in the facts but in the emotion of the space. The letter, the drawer, emptied, the photograph taken. None of it added up to crime, in the strictest sense. Yet something had passed between the two men, something that had altered the air of the room. Even in death, Jules Lenoir had seemed prepared, not surprised. And Marcel, if it was indeed Marcel, had not come to destroy, but to recover something, a memory perhaps, or a debt. Maigret sat in the armchair again, where Lenoir had likely sat. He leaned back, feeling the slight give of the cushion, the draft from the window's loose frame, the weight of years pressed into the fabric. He reached again for the chessboard, but did not touch the pieces. He studied their positions, a game in progress, abandoned midway, black bishop removed, then returned. White queen pushed too far forward. Not a winning position, but one that suggested boldness. He wondered if the game had been played alone or in company. And if in company, with whom? Downstairs, the bell above the shop door rang once. The sound echoed faintly up the stairwell. Maigret stood, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached the shop floor just as the door was closing behind a tall man in a rain-dark coat. His hat was soaked. His shoulders hunched not from cold but from weariness. He stood with his back to the door for a moment, and then, as if sensing Maigret's gaze, turned slowly. There was no alarm in his face, just recognition. His eyes settled on Maigret, and though he did not smile, there was no fear, only something like inevitability. "I thought you might come back," Maigret said. The man removed his hat. His hair was thinning at the temples, his mustache carefully trimmed. Water dripped from the hem of his coat. "I had nowhere else to go," he said simply. "You're Marcel?" He nodded once. "I didn't mean to disappear. I couldn't stay in that room. I walked for hours." Maigret motioned toward the back room. Marcel followed him silently, brushing a hand along the counter as he passed, as though reacquainting himself with its texture. When they reached the small room behind the curtain, Maigret gestured to the bench. Marcel sat, slowly, as though unsure his legs would support him for much longer. His eyes wandered to the vase, the tools, the empty drawer. "It was still here," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure if he'd kept it." "What was in it?" Maigret asked. Marcel hesitated. "Letters. From my mother. From the time after she died. Letters Jules had kept. He never showed them to me. I think he meant to. One day. Maybe. Or maybe he just didn't know what to do with them. You came back for them. I didn't know I would. Not at first. I thought I just wanted to see him, to look him in the face, and ask why he let me vanish, why he took the promise, and then turned it into something cold and mechanical, like the rest of his life. But you didn't ask." "No." Maigret watched him for a long moment. "You left that letter," he said, his tone not accusing, only firm. Marcel nodded. "I meant it to frighten him a little, to make him remember." "He remembered," Maigret said softly. "And he died before he could answer." Marcel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were damp but dry of tears. "I was here when he fell," he said. "I didn't go upstairs. I never touched him, but I heard him. I heard the cup fall. I knew something had happened, and you locked the door. I didn't want anyone else to find him. Not yet. I needed to take the letters. They were mine." Maigret nodded slowly. He reached for his pipe, turned it once in his hand, then placed it on the bench. "You didn't kill him," he said. "But your return, it stirred something. Maybe it was the weight of the years, the regret, or just the knowledge that he would finally have to speak the truth. That can be a kind of death too." Marcel said nothing. Maigret stood. "You'll need to come with me. There'll be questions, formal ones. I understand, but I don't think you'll be charged. Not for anything the law recognizes." Marcel rose. He looked around the room again, his eyes lingering on the sandwich plate, the coat rack, the small, carefully arranged wall of keys. Then he looked at Maigret. "Do you think he forgave me?" Maigret met his gaze. "I think he had already started to." He led Marcel out through the front of the shop. The rain had ceased, but the street glistened with its memory. The officers fell in step behind them as they made their way down Rue des Dames, and in the narrow house, the silence returned. Not heavy now, but gentle. A quiet left by resolution, not erasure. Upstairs, the chessboard waited. The bishop in its rightful place, the game unfinished, but understood. The precinct was quieter than usual when they arrived. The long corridor lined with offices barely murmuring with movement behind closed doors. Rainwater dripped from the hem of Marcel's coat, pooling quietly on the tiled floor as he followed Maigret past the desk sergeant and up the narrow flight of stairs. No handcuffs, no man on either side, just Maigret leading, and Marcel behind him, walking with the slow, conscious tread of someone who knew what it meant to wait a long time for things to catch up. Inside the interview room, the air smelled faintly of ink and damp wool. Maigret motioned to the chair across from the table and removed his coat before sitting. Marcel, still wet, hesitated for a moment before settling into the wooden seat. His hands, clasped before him on the table, were not shaking, not from fear, not even from fatigue, but they bore the small abrasions of someone who'd worked with machines, tools, or perhaps just memory. There was no urgency in Maigret's movements. He took out his pipe, tapped it clean, refilled it. The ritual gave the silence weight, allowed it to settle naturally into the room. Only once the pipe was lit and smoking evenly did he begin. "I won't ask again what happened," Maigret said. "Not yet. What I'd like to understand is why now." Marcel exhaled slowly, eyes not on Maigret but on the table's scratched surface. He seemed to be searching for something in the wood grain, a shape, a name, a rhythm. "I suppose," he said quietly, "I had nothing left to avoid." Maigret watched him. "For years I thought I could forget him. Jules, that if I made enough space, moved often enough, changed jobs, let people mispronounce my name, that I could undo the part of me that still waited for him to remember me." Maigret nodded, not to agree but to signal he was listening. "But it doesn't go. You tell yourself you don't care, and it becomes something else, something worse. I didn't come back to punish him. I came because I realized I still wanted him to look at me, just once, and not as a burden. And when you finally saw him, he looked tired, older, but not surprised." Maigret leaned forward slightly. "Did you speak?" "Only briefly. He didn't invite me upstairs. He offered coffee. I said no. I left the letter later, after he'd closed the shop. So he knew you were here. I think he always did. I think that's why he never wrote." "Maigret, let that settle. Did he tell you why he never honored the promise?" Marcel shook his head. We both pretended not to need the conversation, but it was the only one that mattered. "Yes." Maigret let the silence return. He was used to it. It gave shape to words that hadn't yet been spoken. He watched Marcel's face, not hard, not pressing, just observing. The weariness there was not theatrical. It had settled into the muscles around his mouth, the corners of his eyes, as if it had been built layer by layer over years of slow, daily ache. "And the letters?" Maigret asked finally. Marcel's hands moved then lightly. "He kept them. I saw them the night he died. He had them wrapped in brown paper, string knotted so tightly. I had to cut it. He'd never opened some of them, but he kept them." "You took them." "I had to." Maigret did not press further. He understood. In the eyes of the law, Marcel had done little. No break-in, no theft of value, only a removal of something deeply private. He had not assaulted, threatened, or extorted, but he had changed something. Disturbed a memory that had been sealed too long. "I'll keep your statement," Maigret said after a moment. "There'll be a report, of course, but I don't expect charges. Officially, there's no crime." Marcel looked up for the first time in several minutes. "But unofficially." "Unofficially," Maigret said, tapping ash into the tray. "You've already served your sentence." The man across from him gave a dry smile. No joy in it, only recognition. "Where will you go now?" Maigret asked. "I don't know. I hadn't thought past this." Maigret stood, stretched his legs slowly, and moved to the window. The rain had started again, finer this time, veiling the river in a gauze of silver. The city below carried on, indifferent and vast. He turned back. "There's a guest house on Rue des Abbesses, quiet, run by a widow who overcharges for soup, but never asks questions. I'll write her a note." Marcel nodded. Thank you. Maigret walked him downstairs himself. The officers at the desk looked up, curious, but silent. Maigret's expression gave them no invitation. Outside, the rain had deepened again. Marcel paused at the threshold. I was 12 when they sent me to him, he said softly. I had a suitcase with both hands wrapped around the handle. I thought it meant something. Maigret said nothing. He watched as the man stepped into the rain, his figure swallowed quickly by the gray. Back inside, Maigret returned to his office and closed the door. The warmth of the room greeted him like a distant thought. He removed his coat, sat heavily in the chair, and opened the folder that contained his notes, the photograph, the letter, the thin report with the medical examiner's stamp. He thought about Lenoir, about a man who had made a promise out of love or obligation, then buried it beneath routine. A man who had lived in precision, in careful lines and labeled drawers, but who had left the most important drawer full and untouched for years. And then, one night, when silence came to collect, he had done nothing to stop it. Maigret closed the folder. Outside, the river darkened. He found himself wishing the chessboard had been finished, that someone had made the final move, even if it meant losing. There was something noble in conceding the truth before time was up. But life was not chess, and people, he knew too well, rarely ended games with clean hands. They left pieces out of place, and then waited for someone else to notice. He lit his pipe. The smoke curled toward the ceiling like memory returning to itself. He would write the report in the morning. For now, he sat and listened to the soft, persistent rain. It was late, but not quite night, when Maigret finally stepped out of his office and into the quiet hallway of the Quai des Orfèvres. The lights along the corridor cast long, pale reflections in the polished floor, interrupted only by the occasional shadow of a chair or umbrella left near a door. The building had that particular silence familiar to men who worked too long after the urgency had passed. Not the stillness of calm, but the hum of things waiting to be forgotten. He took his time descending the stairs. There was no need to rush. Marcel was gone, not far, but gone. The case, if it could even be called that, was complete in the only way these things ever were, not with a resolution that pleased everyone, but with an understanding that nothing more could be done. The letter would go into the file. So would the photograph. The drawer would remain empty, and Maigret, as always, would be left with the weight of what could not be written down, the part of every story that never quite fit into a report. He crossed the street to the cafe opposite the building, the one he preferred when he didn't want to be known. It was small, darkly lit, run by an old couple who rarely asked questions and always served the beer cold. He ordered a bottle, not a glass, and took his seat at the window, where the rain left thin, winding trails on the glass. Outside, Paris glowed with its usual anonymity, lights soft behind curtains, the occasional whistle of a bicycle tire, steam rising from grates into the damp night. He watched it all pass without urgency, as though each movement outside confirmed the decision he'd made not to go home just yet. Madame Maigret would understand. She always did. She would have prepared a meal he would not eat, warmed the room he would not sleep in until late, but she would not ask for explanations. It was her quiet way of giving him space to carry what did not belong to her. He drank slowly, letting the bitterness settle in his mouth. His mind turned not to Marcel, nor to Lenoir, but to the woman who had sent those letters, Marcel's mother, the woman whose handwriting had remained sealed in that drawer all those years, a woman long gone, her voice trapped in ink and forgotten paper. She had once trusted Jules Lenoir to care for her son, and he had accepted that trust with a handshake or a nod, or perhaps nothing more than a sigh. Then he had failed. Not violently, not cruelly, but with distance, silence, and the slow retreat of emotion. And still, he had kept the letters. Maigret took out his pipe, turned it over in his hand, and set it down beside the bottle. The letters hadn't been destroyed. That mattered. In a way, it was more meaningful than words. It was Lenoir's silent confession, one he had carried until the end. The knowledge that he had not done what he was supposed to do, and the refusal to pretend otherwise. He paid quietly, nodded to the owner, and stepped back into the street. The rain had slowed to a fine mist. The air smelled of wet stone and drifting smoke. It was the kind of evening that blurred the city's edges. No sharp corners, no hard lines, only the illusion of continuity between one life and the next. Instead of turning toward his home, Maigret walked slowly, following the route he had taken with Marcel only hours before. The locksmith's shop would be dark now, sealed again with official tape and a lock turned twice. There would be no light in the upper window. Jean would be gone, but something about returning felt necessary. Not to check anything, not to investigate, but to allow the story to settle where it began. He passed a group of students, laughing beneath umbrellas, a woman walking her dog with a paper bag clutched to her chest. They moved around him without noticing. He liked that, being unremarkable. He turned onto Rue de Dame and approached the narrow house once more. It was just as he expected, shuttered, silent, the streetlight casting a faint glow across the front window, now veiled in condensation. He stood for a long time outside, hands in his pockets, staring not at the door or the curtain but at the small brass key display in the window. Each key was still neatly pinned, labeled in tiny, careful handwriting. It had not been changed in years, the same models, the same arrangement, as if time inside the shop had been asked to wait, politely and indefinitely. The keys were not remarkable. None were elaborate, none gilded or rare. They were ordinary keys for ordinary lives. Apartment doors, mailboxes, trunks, cabinets. Each one had opened something. Each had closed something behind it. Maigret stepped closer and read one label near the top right. It was marked 17B. Nothing more. He wondered if it had ever been claimed. Behind him, a car passed. A window shut 2 floors above. A cat darted across the street and disappeared into the alley. He lit his pipe at last, and let the smoke drift upward, dissolving slowly into the damp night. He thought of the letter Marcel had not finished. "You told her I would not be alone." A sentence that did not accuse but remembered. Then he thought of the chessboard. Perhaps, in his final days, Jules Lenoir had begun the game alone, not to win, but to prove he still knew how to play, that he had once known the rules, even if he had chosen not to follow them. And the bishop, moved, displaced, returned. That piece now felt like a message left for whoever understood the silence between men better than the things they said aloud. Maigret tapped his pipe gently against the railing, pocketed it, and turned to leave. He walked slowly back down Rue de Dame, past the shuttered tobacconist and the glowing creperie that still buzzed faintly with voices inside. He did not stop. He did not look back. The city stretched out before him, wet, quiet, unhurried. There would be another case, another door to knock, another silence to unravel. But for now, the mystery had receded into memory, where it would remain not solved, not concluded, but understood. That, Maigret had learned long ago, was all there ever was. He crossed the street as the rain began again, gentle, persistent. Not enough to quicken his steps, just enough to soften the edges of things. Maigret walked without direction, letting the rain thread itself into the wool of his coat, into the brim of his hat, the scent of wet stone rising around him like something old and familiar. The night had taken on a translucent hush, the kind that blurred time, where a street lamp flickering behind lace curtains might just as well belong to yesterday, and a closed door, and a closed door, and a might hold voices that hadn't spoken in years. He moved slowly, the way one does not from fatigue, but from respect for the quiet that had been earned. The case, if it could be called that, had reached its conclusion in the most Maigret-like of ways, not with handcuffs or headlines, but with a conversation, not with confrontation, but with the measured weight of listening. The man had come to confess something wordless, and the dead man, through his silences and omissions, had confessed just as much. What remained now were the echoes, and Maigret, as always, found himself walking through them, listening as they faded. He turned down Rue de la Félicité, A modest street half lit by the glow of a small cafe where the last customers of the night were being gently ushered out. The clatter of cutlery and quiet laughter drifted out for a moment before the door closed behind them. He passed without looking in. The rain had tapered again, and the cobblestones were slick with reflection. His footsteps made no sound. The city seemed to exhale. At the end of the street he paused, struck by a small, almost imperceptible pull of instinct. It came not from sound, nor sight, but from the delicate disturbance of something familiar, a shadow that hesitated where it shouldn't. A movement slightly too still. He turned slowly and saw her. Jane stood across the street, beneath the overhang of a shuttered florist. Her coat was buttoned high, and her hair was hidden beneath a scarf the color of dry ash. She looked neither surprised nor frightened to see him, only resigned, as if her presence there had been inevitable. Maigret crossed slowly, tipping his hat as he neared. She didn't move. "You're not the kind of woman who wanders at night," he said softly. "No," she replied, her voice low. "But sometimes the night wanders to you." He studied her face. It was calm, composed, but her hands were not in her pockets. They were folded, tightly, in front of her, the fingertips pale from pressure. "I thought you should know something," she said, after a moment. "I remembered a detail. It came back to me just after you left." He waited. "The day before Marcel arrived, Monsieur Lenoir asked me to clean the upstairs room more thoroughly than usual. He said someone might be staying. He didn't say who. He never asked for that, not in all the years. He told me to change the sheets." Maigret's expression didn't shift, but something inside him stilled. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked gently. "I didn't think it mattered. At first, I thought maybe he hoped Marcel wouldn't come, or that if he did, he'd only stay briefly. But it wasn't just the visit. He was preparing." Maigret nodded slowly, the shape of the thing clarifying. "He was ready to let him in," he said. "Yes, but he never did." She looked away then, toward the slick street, and the reflection of their figures in the windows opposite. Maybe he waited too long, or maybe Marcel came too early, or maybe they were both too proud. Maigret said nothing. There was no contradiction in her words, only the quiet, bitter truth of people who had meant to act, and instead delayed until the moment passed them by. "I saw him once," she continued, sitting by the chessboard alone. "It wasn't a real game. He was playing against himself, but he always left the black bishop off the board. I asked once if it had broken. He said no. He said some things don't belong in the middle of a game." Maigret exhaled quietly, through his nose. The bishop again moved, displaced, replaced. It had not been a random gesture, not a... "I think," she said softly, "he was waiting for someone to take the black pieces, someone who never came." Maigret looked at her. "Do you know where Marcel is now?" "Yes. The Rue d'Avabès." "You were right, the woman there overcharges for soup." He smiled faintly. "I haven't seen him," she added, "but I asked. I don't know what he's doing." "He's deciding whether to begin something new," Maigret said, "or vanish again." They stood, for a moment, in silence. Then she took a step back. "I should go," she said. He nodded. "You've said what needed saying." She hesitated. "Do you think forgiveness ever arrives too late?" Maigret looked at her. "No," he said. "But it arrives quieter than we expect. And it rarely stays." She gave a nod, not of agreement but of recognition, then turned and walked off down the street. He watched her go, the outline of her coat, the slight sway of her shoulders, until she disappeared around the corner. Maigret turned toward the scene. The wind had shifted, warmer now, and carried the faint smell of coal smoke and baking bread from some late-night boulangerie. He followed the curve of the embankment, past shuttered bookstalls and puddles of floating leaves. The rhythm of his walk returned, slow and steady, the way it always did after something unresolved had finally made its peace with being unfinished, because that was what this had been. Not a case, not even a death, in the way his superiors would want it written. It had been a reckoning, one that began before he arrived, and would continue long after the files were stamped and shelved. A locksmith who had left his door open for years, but never his heart. A boy grown into a man who had finally returned, not to demand justice but to ask why he had never been enough. And between them, silence. Heavy, complicated silence that said more than either of them could. Maigret stopped at a bridge, resting his elbows on the stone railing. Below, the river moved without sound, black and glossy under the street lamps. He did not need to speak aloud to know what he was thinking. Jules Lenoir had not died of guilt or fear. He had died because his body gave out the moment his spirit tried to step forward. He had prepared the room. He had told Jean to clean. He had known Marcel was coming. He had not opened the door. That was the part no report could hold. And Marcel, for all his waiting, had come too soon. Or perhaps just a moment too late. The moment that might have held words instead of silence. Maigret stood there until the bell struck one, until the streets behind him were nothing but dimmed echoes and shuttered windows. Then he turned, slowly, and walked home. No tram, no taxi, just the sound of his shoes in the wet hush of Paris. When he reached the quiet of his building, Madame Maigret was not asleep. The light was on, the teapot still warm. She looked up, said nothing, and moved the cup toward him. He took it, sat beside her, and sipped slowly. He did not tell her what had happened. He didn't need to. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight, not bold enough to dry the rooftops, but strong enough to make the wet shimmer. Maigret stood by the window of his modest kitchen, the cup of coffee in his hand cooling unnoticed. Madame Maigret moved behind him with her quiet efficiency, tidying without disturbing. The silence between them was familiar, companionable. There was no need for talk. Not yet. Last night's walk, the long pause at the bridge, Jen's face beneath the florist's awning, all of it still played through his mind, like an old reel spinning at a steady rhythm. When the knock came at the door, it was a gentle one. No urgency, no businesslike tapping of an officer. Maigret opened it to find Le Ponty, hat in hand, cheeks flushed from the morning chill. "There's something I thought you'd want to see," he said. Maigret stepped aside and let the young man in. Le Ponty always brought a touch of energy with him, not reckless, but eager. He stood with his coat still on, holding a folded piece of paper in his gloved hand. "I went by the Rue des Abbesses," he said, "as you suggested, just in case." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "He's gone," Le Ponty continued. "Checked out early. Left a note with the landlady, addressed to you." Maigret held out his hand. Le Ponty passed him the paper without further commentary. It was a single page, folded once, the handwriting neat and deliberate. Maigret opened it slowly. "Inspector, you were kinder than I expected. Please don't look for me. This city is too full of echoes. I'm taking the silence with me this time. Marcel." There was no address, no forwarding details, no indication of destination. Just a signature that felt like a sigh. Maigret folded the note again and set it beside his coffee. Madame Maigret appeared in the doorway, glanced at Le Ponty, then at her husband. "More coffee?" she asked. Le Ponty shook his head politely. Maigret gave a nod, and she disappeared again. He looked at the young officer. Did the landlady see which direction he went? She said east, but not definite. Just a guess. He was carrying a suitcase. Maigret grunted. "East." Le Ponty shifted slightly. "Should we try the stations?" Maigret shook his head. "If he wants to be found, he'll leave breadcrumbs. If not, then it's finished." Le Ponty seemed about to object, but something in Maigret's tone quieted him. He stepped back toward the door, still polite, still restrained. "Let me know if anything changes," he said. Maigret nodded. "Thank you." After the door closed, Maigret returned to the window. The street below was ordinary again. Women walking with bread under their arms, a boy dragging a satchel too large for him, a man locking up his bicycle with a habitual gesture. The world had not shifted, not visibly, but something in him had settled. Not satisfaction, not pride, something quieter. like closing a drawer that had stood open too long. He dressed slowly, put on his heavier coat, and walked without explanation back toward the locksmith's shop. The key still hung from his ring. He let himself in quietly. The interior was unchanged. The faint smell of oil and dust, the drawn curtain, the ticking silence that belonged to empty rooms. He made his way upstairs. The parlor was just as they had left it. The bishop remained in its square. He sat down at the chessboard and studied it. The game had meant something, not just a habit, but a metaphor. Jules Lenoir had lived by. Always pieces in place, always a move ahead. Yet in the end, the one piece left outside the game had held the meaning. That which did not belong had spoken loudest. Maigret reached out and moved a pawn forward. Not to win, just to acknowledge the invitation that had been waiting too long. The black pieces remained untouched on the opposite side. When he descended again, Jeanne was waiting in the shop. She stood by the window, her coat open, her hands bare. She did not ask if Marcel had returned. She knew he hadn't. "I lit the stove upstairs," Maigret said. "It's colder than it was." She nodded. "I'll take care of it." He hesitated. "Would you keep the key for now?" Her eyes flicked up, surprised. "Me." He handed it to her. "The authorities will seal the property eventually. But until then, it's better in hands that knew it." She took it without another word. She slipped it into her pocket as though she had always carried it. "I think he wanted to say something," she said softly. "They both did," Maigret replied. "But they forgot how." She looked around the room, not with sentiment, but with the awareness of someone recognizing the exact weight of a space left behind. "I'll clean upstairs," she said. "Then I'll leave it alone." Maigret nodded once, then stepped back into the street. The air was clearer now, the wind softer. He lit his pipe and walked back toward the sign. He had no meetings that morning, no cases pressing, only thought. He thought about all the times justice had nothing to do with courts or confessions, all the lives that had turned on silences, not crimes. Lenoir had not been punished by law, but by memory, and Marcel, for all his leaving, had been shaped by the return. At the bridge, Maigret paused again. He stood quietly, letting the light shift across the water. The city had resumed its rhythm. The bells, the rumble of distant trams, the faint voices rising through open windows. He reached into his coat and unfolded the letter one more time. "Please don't look for me. This city is too full of echoes. I'm taking the silence with me." He folded it again and tucked it into his inner pocket. Then he turned from the bridge and walked on, the echo of his steps quiet, steady, already dissolving into the cobblestones behind him. The following week passed, with the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. The locksmith's shop remained shuttered. A discreet notice, posted by the city, announced the estate was pending inventory and legal resolution. A few locals paused to read it, then moved on. The upstairs curtains, still drawn, had begun to fade in the sun. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret filed the final report. It was thinner than most. No criminal charges, no autopsy of note. The cause of death, natural. The involvement of Marcel Lenoir, non-criminal. Yet beneath the official phrasing, in his handwriting, small in the margin, he added one line: "Matter resolved through human understanding, not law." It was an entry no one would question. His superiors preferred clarity, but they knew better than to ask Maigret for tidy conclusions. He worked in what they called gray cases, cases where guilt was not measured by broken laws but by what time, memory and silence had done to people. On a quiet Friday afternoon, he returned once more to Rue des Dames. Not as a policeman, not with a case to close, but as a man who had watched something unspoken reach its final breath and needed to see the place where it had drawn it. The street was the same. Paris, in all its layered indifference, had moved on. The tobacconist next door had changed its window display. The creperie now advertised something called a galette du printemps. He stood outside the locksmith shop for a long moment, eyes on the keys still pinned in rows behind the fogged glass. Dust had begun to gather on them. Then Jean stepped out from the alley. She wore no gloves, no scarf. Her coat was open at the collar, her face calm. She didn't look surprised to see him. "They've decided the property will go to auction," she said. He nodded. "They offered me a list of the contents," she added. "I said no. I told them everything worth keeping had already been taken." They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the storefront as if expecting it to speak. "He never wanted much," she said. "Just quiet, tools in place. No one needing anything. But someone did." "Yes." She turned to him then. "Have you heard anything?" He shook his head. Marceau left no trail, no hotel records, no ticket stubs, nothing. She didn't look disappointed, only resigned. "He was never made for the city," she said quietly. "But he came back anyway. That should count for something." "It does," Maigret said. "More than anyone will write down." A pause. Then he took the bishop. She looked at him. "From the chessboard," he said. "The black bishop. It's gone." Her mouth curved into something just short of a smile. He finally made his move. "Yes." They parted without ceremony. She walked up the street toward the bus stop, and Maigret stayed a while longer, watching the empty window. Then, with a final glance at the silent keys, he turned and walked away. By the time he reached the boulevard, the first drops of rain had returned. Gentle, unhurried. He didn't raise his collar. Some cases didn't end with arrests. They ended in reconciliations that never quite arrived, in forgiveness delivered in the form of quiet exits, in the retrieval of an old photograph or a drawer finally emptied. In this case, the only clue left unsolved was the life that might have been, a boy's promise deferred, an uncle's silence endured, and a game left unfinished. But Maigret, pipe in hand, coat growing heavier with rain, had made peace with that. Some endings were like certain kinds of locksmiths. They did not force the door. They waited until the lock turned from the inside.